All right, hi Dan.
Hello. Thanks for playing for us.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's my pleasure. And I am supposed to teach you how to play the intro to Reward.
Yes.
And so the melody just goes like this. All right, now just do the whole thing by yourself.
Do you see the color drape on my face?
Do it by yourself, then play the whole thing. I like how his fingers went up like this.
All right. Thanks,
You're
Josh.
natural.
Thank you. All right. Hey everyone, this is Dan, and this is also my friend here, Josh Yeoh. He's a speaker, songwriter, he's a singer, he's a minister across the different parts of the world. And today we're very privileged to have you here teaching me how to play the introduction for your song.
The biggest thing I've ever done in my life.
And for those of us, if you want to watch the entire video of Josh singing Reward and being ministered by the song, the link is in the description below. Now, thanks for teaching me how to play the introduction, and clearly I've got a lot to work on, and you have been doing this for a long time.
You did very well.
Thank you.
We only worked on it for 6 hours, so that's
But thanks for coming all the way here. I mean, and spending time with us to talk about your journey. And obviously, I'm not just here to have you here to teach me to play the keyboard, but to tell us a little bit more about your ministry journey and how the Lord has called you into different parts of the world. When people think of Josh, some of you might have followed his music ministry and his worship ministry, his prayer ministry, and you think, wow, this guy who's come up with many different albums, he spent a lot of time on stage, speaking, ministering in conferences all around the world. But everyone has an origin story. And what I really hope for us to hear from you today is, how did you start? This series is called Start Somewhere, and the idea is that all of us started somewhere, no matter where we are at in our journey now, and therefore anyone can start somewhere. So maybe could you tell me a little bit more about how you started? What were some of the struggles maybe you had along the way? How the Lord sustained you?
Yeah. Well, I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and then no, just kidding. It's not my origin story. But I went to school in the U.S. Graduated when I was about 22, 23, and I guess with all origin stories, usually there's some kind of crisis that happens that sets things into motion, and my story is kind of like that, because after I graduated, I actually went back to the US to work, and I was in a relationship with a girl over there. And what happened was the day I arrived, so I arrived on Friday the 13th. I remember that because of
ominous.
Yeah, it's ominous and foreshadowing of what's about to happen.
Yeah.
But I was supposed to start work on Monday. Arrived on Friday, found out that they rescinded the job offer.
Ooh.
And then on Saturday, I got dumped. So within a span of 48 hours, the 2 reasons that I went back to the US were taken away from me.
Wow.
And so that was kind of how I found myself, thrust into this turmoil, and I didn't really know what I was supposed to do in the midst of all that. But it was because of that that things turned out the way that they did. So one was my dad, actually, in the wake of this tragedy, I guess, what he told me was, Josh, why don't you tithe your year to the Lord?
Wow.
Right? And he was like, all your friends just graduated, and they're going to look for the best paying job or whatever, but what if you tithe your year to the Lord and see what he'll do with it? What's interesting was he actually said the magic word after that. He said, I'll take care of your groceries.
Wait, this is your dad, or this is
my dad?
God?
My dad. No,
Okay.
My earthly dad said he will pay for my groceries.
Okay,
and so I'm
okay.
like, okay, I'll tithe my year to the Lord. But that turned out to be the year that the Lord would really redirect and interrupt my life, right?
Yeah.
And one day I was actually brushing my teeth, right? And in the midst of that, the Lord just brought me back to a memory from when I was 16 years old. You've all been to church camp, youth camps, right?
Yeah.
And you do carpet time, right? Where you're on your face on the carpet and you're crying, Lord, I give you my life. And I remember praying this prayer, and I don't recommend you pray it unless you really need it, because as a 16-year-old, I prayed this prayer. I said, Lord, if you ever want me to serve you full time, you have to interrupt my life and show me that's what you want me to do.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, as I'm brushing my teeth, the Lord brought me back to that moment and he's
Yeah.
like, Josh, what do you think I'm doing?
Wow.
And so that was how the Lord interrupted my life in response to a prayer I prayed when I was 16.
Yeah.
And he dumped me into the prayer movement and what he's doing in the place of worship and prayer.
Yeah.
And called me into full-time ministry.
Wow.
And I think that's how I started.
Yeah.
That year.
How old were you at that time?
I think I just turned 23.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it was Friday,
Yeah.
lost my job. Saturday, lost my girlfriend. Monday was supposed to start my job. Tuesday was my birthday. so it was a very eventful 23-year-old birthday that I had. Yeah, and yeah, it was. But it's usually in that kind of environment when the Lord gets your attention by doing something this dramatic. And I mean, like since then, there have been other dramatic things, but that was probably the most dramatic interruption I've had in my life. My career path at that point was I was going to work for a year and I was going to work with autistic kids and then become a clinical psychologist. That was my post-graduate kind of plan. But the Lord pulled me into ministry. So I worked with a college ministry in Minnesota in the US. It was really the dream worship leader job. You know, I was like leading worship for their conferences and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was working on my first CD. CD.
CD.
Back then.
Yeah. What are CDs?
What CDs? We're not that old. My Spotify. And so it was, yeah. And then that year, I did a lot of ministry on campus, and the Lord really birthed a prayer movement. You know, we ended up doing like 24 hours for one whole week in the spring term, 168 hours nonstop.
Wow.
Like we prayed for all sorts of people getting healed.
Wow.
So it was in the midst of all of those things, the Lord was getting my heart. He was calling me into full-time ministry.
Yeah.
And at the peak of all of that, right, when I was like, okay, I think I can live the rest of my life here in the US, he said, Josh, I want you to go back to Malaysia. And that was, I think it was really a moment where I learned this lesson that not every open door is the Lord. You know, a lot of times we pray that prayer, right? We're like, God, if it's you, you open the door. I realized in that moment there's not a substitute for walking in intimacy with Him.
Yeah.
Because there are going to be many opportunities, right? And you've had tons of opportunities, but not all of them is from the Lord. And so coming back to Malaysia felt like a step backwards. But I felt like saying yes to the Lord was saying yes to the adventure that He had planned for my life, even though I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, boys.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I got started.
Yeah.
And then things got crazy after that.
Yeah. So actually, so if I roll back the tapes to when you started, right, when you were about to turn 23, you had your whole life set up for you. You had you had your career.
I'm a J. I'm a planner.
Yeah. And you had a career. You had possibly a girlfriend that it could be your wife. But then the Lord took it all away. He set you on a different path.
Yeah.
Brought you through a season for 1 year where you were enjoying it. You were in the Lord's presence. It was a fruitful time of ministry. And then He brought you again and said, "We're gonna get you out of there."
Yeah.
When everything was going well,
Yeah.
back to Malaysia where it didn't feel like there was anything for you.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell me a little
Story
bit
of my
more?
life.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot more that goes on after that. Maybe tell me a little bit about some of the struggles that you experienced along the way.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like going back to Malaysia was a step into the unknown, even though it was going back to what I knew, right? Is that back then when Finding Nemo first came out, there was that scene where, he swims out into the ocean and then like he can't see up or down or right or left. And that's how it felt for me. I was like stepping into the unknown with the Lord. And going back was to start the House of Prayer, right? Which eventually it really grew, and then we planted houses of prayer throughout the region, started training programs, ran 8 years of it, and did like a regional prayer leaders gathering kind of thing. So it was very fruitful, but I feel like throughout that process, a few struggles that I went through. So one was, of course, the struggle of provision, right? Because it was a life of living by faith. So basically my income for all my 20s and some of my 30s was zero, right? It was just, but I mean, that was the backdrop for how the Lord did a lot of miracles, how I got gifted a car, brand new car, all the trips that I had to make, someone would call me and say, I was praying today, the Lord told me to give you this much, and it was the exact amount I needed.
Wow.
It was stuff like that happened, but it was the very real struggle of looking at the bank account being like, I'm not earning anything.
Yeah.
And so I feel like It was one of the things I had to go through,
Yeah.
but there was also relationship stuff, right? Not so much romantic, but even friendships, because all my peers were pursuing a specific trajectory, but I was kind of like doing this thing where I'm like doing something that not a lot of people were doing.
Yeah.
And
Nor
so,
understand and
no,
empathize.
yeah, that's the thing. I feel like that's one of the things that really strengthens people who are stepping out to live missionally or living by faith, is to have others say, we believe in this, even though it looks crazy to the world, but there's value in that and you're doing it because the Lord's called you to do it. I feel like that's very important. But that's one of the struggles I had to go through as well. Like where's my tribe? Where are the people who believe in what I'm called to do?
Yeah.
But I think the thing that was the biggest struggle for me was actually the fear of regret. It was a very specific fear. It was like that I would wake up when I was 30 years old and regret how I spent my 20s. Yeah, and so it was one of those things. So when I turned like 29, like when I was about to turn 30, that was the thing that was in my mind. I was like, oh my gosh. And I started making lists of things that I was proud of doing. It's like countries I visited, and I was almost up to 30. I wanted to do 30 and 30, but I didn't. 29 out of 30 or something. And I was trying to figure out like what's, like how did I live my 20s to justify where I was?
Yeah.
But the crazy thing was when I woke up when I turned 30 on my birthday, right?
Yeah.
Didn't have an ounce of regret.
Yeah.
I didn't have a lot in my bank account.
Yeah.
I didn't have a lot in terms of what the world says you should have gotten by the time you turn 30.
As success
As
measures.
successful. But I realized that I did not have a single ounce of regret of how I lived my 20s.
Wow.
The things that I seen the Lord do, the history I built with Him, the people that He brought alongside, and the people that I was able to sow into and who sowed into my life.
Yeah.
In fact, before I made another transition, so the pattern of my life is like things go really well, and then the Lord says, "Now move, do the next thing." And He actually moved me to Singapore, and I gave up everything, left everything in Penang, and then moved to Singapore. But even in the midst of all that, I remember my dad telling me this, that when you look back on that season of your life, you measure it in the people that you've impacted and the people that you've journeyed with.
Yeah, that's right.
And I realized looking back, like the Lord has really blessed me with amazing friends, amazing people. I mean, don't know if I would have met you even if I had not said yes to this, path, right?
That's true.
And I feel like our lives are a lot more rich because of the relationships that we've built with one another in the Lord. Yeah. So that's I think that was my biggest struggle, is the fear of regret.
Yeah.
And it didn't really go away. I wish, like 30, magical, wake up, boom, there's no more fear of regret.
Yeah.
Now it's like I'm almost, right? And there's always that fear of regret.
Yeah.
But I feel like what I've learned or what I've experienced is when you sow into what He's called you to do, things of eternal worth, of eternal value, He's not going to shortchange you. Like
Amen.
He's, right?
Amen. Yeah, I'm sure that resonates with a lot of us, and especially with the younger ones, right? Because maybe some of us when we were younger, or some of us who are younger, feel like the Lord is calling you to something. He's given you a dream and a sense of purpose and a call in your life, but then you're looking at that and you're looking at your friends like, there's huge opportunity cost if I were to pursue that.
Yeah.
And then I see my friends pursuing other things.
Yes.
And then there's also the security of finance. Like, I'm going to let go of a whole bunch of stuff if I'm going to pursue that. And for you also is this fear of regret that one day you wake up, it's like, what was all that for?
Yeah.
Right? But here's the funny thing, and you've been pursuing this for almost 2 decades of your life. And what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is, you've carried that fear with you, but every single day in the last 2 decades, you've never had an ounce of regret. And even though you're still carrying this fear and this is projected into the future, but you look back at the last decade or two of your life, and the Lord has been faithful. He's been faithful then, He's faithful now, and He will be faithful in the future. And that's such a huge encouragement for all of us.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I feel like 2 decades in, and you say, He's been faithful, but it's the journey of, will He be faithful?
Yeah.
The journey of waking up one day and being like, oh, it doesn't feel like He's faithful, And actually, I was just reminded as you were talking, like one of the first times I was confronted with that was actually here in Australia. I was visiting a friend who went to school with me in the US, and she was a clinical psychologist, and she was doing very well, and that was my career path, right? She had a nice apartment in Melbourne overlooking, I forget what that park is, right? And I went to visit, and I was like, oh, this could have been the life that I was going to live, right?
Yeah.
And so that was a moment for me where I really like wrestled with the Lord. And actually, to be honest, right, you know, like we talk about in the grand scheme of things, there was no regret. But I remember going through like a month or two of like just spiraling and being like, wow, this could have been what I said yes to, you know, this could have been my life, you know, but now I'm this, you know, I can't afford this, I can't do that. And that's a very real struggle. But I feel like that's what it means to count the cost. Right? Like Jesus didn't say just blindly follow. He's like, count the cost and follow me. And, and I literally did something one day when I was like, oh, count the cost. And so I actually went to look up how much would a clinical psychologist have earned, right? And then I multiplied that by the number of years that I was like, okay, I've been doing ministry, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of money. Right? And I was like, but it was a very tender moment before the Lord where I was like, God, this that I would have earned, I gladly lay before you. I mean, in a way, it feels like a bit of a cop-out because it wasn't money that I actually earned, but it felt like that was the cost that I was willing to pay to follow him.
Yeah, and maybe that's a moment that the Lord allowed you to have.
Yes.
Yeah, and to say, Josh, this versus what you had. Now which one? And like, no, Lord, always you. And that's kind of like the song, right? The song that you just sang.
And I got to teach Pastor Dan how to play the intro.
But the content of the song is, no, you are my exceedingly great reward.
Yes.
I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back. So, okay, so tell me a little bit more about, along the journey, what kept you going? I mean, with all these up and downs.
I'm a big why guy. Like, even when I was a kid, I remember my report cards, it's like, I'm inquisitive, like asking why all the time. Why? But I realized that if you live from your why, the how and the what takes care of itself, right? And so I think that was kind of my big thing is like, why am I choosing to live this way? And why am I saying no to these other, you know, opportunities, which are not bad in themselves, right? But why? And really, I'll pull it out and read it to you. It's Philippians 3, verse 7 through 8. And it says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. I think that's really one of my life verses, and really that song too, right? It's like I count it all as loss. And I feel like that's been the place that I go back to over and over and over again. Back when I was, you know, fresh out of university, or when I was moving back to Malaysia, or moving to Singapore, getting married, even considering what's in the future, that we would count it all as loss. You know, I don't think I ever want to come to a place where I've amassed fruit, which is good. I mean, like when you labor with the Lord and you see fruit, it's a gift and it's a blessing, and you should be fruitful, right? But I don't want to come to a place where I'm like, I value the fruit more than I value my journey with the Lord. And if my journey with him requires me putting that fruit aside so that I can know him, so that I can find him. And that at the end of my life, my joy is not that I've planted a bunch of things or you know, raised however many leaders, but my joy is that I know him and I love him and that he knows me. Right? I feel like that would be a life well lived.
Wow. Praise the Lord. Yeah, beautiful. And thanks for sharing your story, and thanks for sharing, you know, how you started, what struggles you went through, what sustained you. And I'm sure many of us were encouraged and have been encouraged. And for those of us who are pursuing God's dreams or wanting to pursue God's dreams, God's call for us in missions, in ministry, I'm sure your story will speak to all of us and then to encourage us. So thanks for encouraging us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's good having you today.
Aussie.
Oi.